So hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Daryl Monto, and we are so glad that you joined us today. Today, we are hosting a Native Initiatives webinar, and today's webinar is titled How to Develop a Culturally Relevant Personal Statement. Just a little bit about me and our organization. I am a citizen of the Kiowa Tribe of Oklahoma, and I serve as the SACNAS Associate Director, Mission Programs and Native Initiatives. I'm coming to you today from the original homelands of the Kaw, Kickapoo, Osage, and Oceti-Sakowin in Lawrence, Kansas. And we also have with us today in the chat, Kent Washington III, SACNAS team member, who will be moderating today and dropping information in the chat from time to time. So be sure and check out the chat. SACNAS is a fully inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM. As the nation's largest multicultural and multidisciplinary diversity organization, SACNAS creates space for all members, volunteers, and partners feel they belong and can embrace their intersectional identities. SACNAS is based out of California, which is the original homelands to over 200 tribal nations, bands, and rancherias of Native American and Indigenous people. We would like to take this time to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the various regions which we all live and work, and honor the rich culture of the Indigenous people across the country. It is our pleasure to coordinate and host these informative and educational webinars. For today's presentation, our speakers will be sharing information on how to develop a culturally relevant personal statement. At the end of the presentation, we will follow with a Q&A session with our presenters. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Naomi Lee, who is an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University. And FYI, Dr. Jocelyn Lee will be joining us here shortly, but I will turn it over to Naomi to allow to provide more information about themselves.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm assuming most are good afternoon, but might be still good morning for some of you. Again, I'm Dr. Naomi Lee. I'm Onondaga or Seneca, so height skin out to all of you. And I see some familiar names that are in attendance. And so again, Dr. Jocelyn Lee will be, she's actually teaching, and so she's gonna run from class. And so I'm gonna get us started. And then once she hops on, maybe she can do a quick introduction of herself and she'll take over the slides. Right. And again, Dr. Jocelyn Lee and we say we're chemistry sisters because, again, we are not blood related. However, we are related in many other ways. And we actually met at ACES when they put our presentations back to back. And we both also happen to be chemists and really going along our career paths kind of jointly and almost the same area right now as far as the number of years we've been faculty members. So again, I hope you can find somebody like that for yourself and they can encourage you. But today we're going to talk about designing culturally relevant personal statements, and we will actually have, in fact, examples from myself and Dr. Jocelyn Lee that we will share with everyone so you can see how they've progressed over the years. And so what is a personal statement, right? So this is really where you are able to talk about your achievements and your interests and about a different job or a program that you're applying to, right? It actually answers the who you are, like who are you and why you're interested in such a program, whether it's a graduate program or if you're applying for a fellowship. And so today we focus primarily on if you're applying to graduate programs. However, you will see with my examples, mine are actually postgraduate school when I was applying to different fellowships. I believe Dr. Jocelyn Lee's are as well. Her personal statement is geared towards a fellowship. I tried looking from when I was back in graduate school, but that was a little bit too long ago to find that information. So a personal statement is not, though, and this is, again, depending on where you're at, you might have to write a research statement or a research interest. If you're applying to faculty positions, you'll have to write a teaching philosophy. Depending on the different types of positions, you might also have to do a diversity statement. And then again, a cover letter, which is typically a 1, maybe a 2-page document. And then again, the main thing, and when I read my own students' personal statement, it is not a narrative of your resume, right? This is really about talking about all the great things that you've done that might not even be in your resume, or you want to highlight something that is very important in your resume. So again, those are different documents, and how you write those documents will vary as well. And so one of the main things when you're writing a personal statement is really knowing who your audience is, whether you're applying to a graduate committee or some sort of funding agency such as the NIH or the NSF, or other type of foundations such as the Ford Foundation, right? So knowing who your audience is and tailoring your personal statement to those specific audiences. And so I'll show you some example of prompts, but knowing that you're actually tailoring also your personal statement to the prompts, the questions that they give you for graduate school, et cetera. And so many times those prompts might be the same, but you're going to see in the examples that I'm going to show you that there is some variability. And so you might have to tailor your personal statement for each of the different applications. And so hopefully some of you are already past this stage. I apologize for the formatting. And you're not, but if you are starting scratch and you haven't written a personal statement, you should really give yourself 6 weeks. And I understand now that if you're applying to graduate school for this coming round, you might be a little behind the curve because a lot of the applications are due actually starting in early December. But don't let that frustrate you or anything if you are just starting to write your personal statement. And again, I say 6 weeks, but you're going to see in mine have varied from 2013 when I showed my first one to 2021 and how it's progressed over the years. And so when you're starting to write a personal statement for the very first time, you really want to just brainstorm ideas, maybe look at the prompts, make sure you're addressing them, and just come up with that outline, right, of what you want to talk about. And we'll get into more of the cultural relevance side of things when Dr. Jocelyn Lee gets on. And then in week 2, really, that's where you just need to start putting things on papers. That is one of the hardest parts about writing anything, is actually starting to draft something. And so having examples, I find, is always best for me. And so that's why I also want to provide examples to all of you so you can kind of see where things have changed or progressed over the years. And then once you have a draft, send it out for feedback. And Dr. Jocelyn Lee will talk about who should be giving you feedback, and why it's important for these types of individuals to give you feedback. And then once you receive that feedback, right, incorporate it, rewrite some of your sentences or paragraphs, right? Not every piece of feedback might be relevant, but it's really up to you to go through the different feedback that you're receiving and see how you can incorporate that in your personal statement. And then you're going to polish it, make it better, make sure that you have good flow. Those transition sentence thoughts, right, are all included and it's not really choppy. And then again, if you send it out for additional feedback, get some more and include that in the next round of edits, right? Because this is a living document. It's something that should continue to change. And even my own personal statement continues to change. And then finally, when you're near the end and you're getting ready to finally press submit and put in your applications, just really check for those spelling and grammar errors. I actually, when I went and was looking through my personal statements to provide to you all, I had all the little squigglies pop up showing all my grammar and spelling errors. I was like, oh, no. So again, take my advice and make sure you look for those things. And so again, the layout, really, it's that opening sentence, and Dr. Jocelyn Lee will talk about like some examples and how to set yourself apart. But these are examples from my different personal statements that you actually go through and read. And you can see kind of how I progressed over the years, where I spent much of my childhood as a teenager living on the Seneca Cattaraugus Indian Reservation located an hour south of Buffalo. It's all right. It tells the reader that I'm most likely Native. I grew up on the reservation, But then if you look at the bottom one where it's my journey to an AU began on the reservation or res blah, 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 right? And so really having that take home, that message in the beginning, I think helps set you apart. And then kind of going back to what I talked about earlier, writing your bullets or knowing who your audience are based on the prompts that are given. And I'll show some examples. Now, typically, personal statements are a 1-page single space or 2-page double spaced. They could vary, but I did notice that some of them have word count, so that might be even less than a 1 page. So it's really important that you pay attention to the word count, the page numbers, etc. So some of the things that I like to do now is I like to bold or underline things to get them to pop. Now that's not always allowed, but if it's something where you're able to upload a document as a reviewer for many different types of grants or funding sources, when I see like those things pop, that helps me read. So again, just see if that's something that's allowed with the way your formatting is and how you're going to upload your documents. And then logical transitions, that's going back to making sure it's not all choppy, etc. And then avoiding cliches, right? So you don't really want to talk about, and we can give some more example of maybe what cliches are later. And so these are just some real examples of prompts that one of my students is currently writing. And so I just highlighted, right, the key points, right? Talking about extracurricular activities, your leadership, potential, and education. This one, you can see that there's a minimum and a maximum number of words that are allowed. And the second one, really, they want you to talk about why you want to go to graduate school, what obstacles you face, right? So they're slightly different, but depending on how you write it or word it, there could be some overlap in your personal statements. And again, this one also has a word limit of only 500. Now, one that's was a little more unique that I saw, and again, remember when I said that these are not research statements, they're not your summary of your resume or anything. This school, for I don't know, whatever reason, they didn't put a word limit, right? But then they really kind of wanted the individual to talk about, you know, their research, their career goals, and then also the more personal side. So again, I don't remember what the word limit is or the page limit is, but this is kind of looks like an all-in-one document put together in this case, because really when you're looking at research, they want the more technical type of information, which isn't usually included in a personal statement. And again, these slides will be available to everybody. And so now I'm going to hand it over, and if Dr. Jocelyn Lee wants to quickly introduce herself, she's going to take over from here.
All right, can you all hear me fine? Okay, thanks. So I'm Dr. Jocelyn Lee. I'm currently faculty at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. We're a primary undergrad institution. I had lecture just right before this, so I'm sorry to be a little bit late, but I do have other things this afternoon, so this fit in great. And I currently teach biochemistry and chemistry. I have a research lab studying acidophiles, so having a chance to go from undergrad to grad school, postdoc to then faculty, you do have to have these personal statements. So I help students write them. And I think what Naomi has highlighted has definitely been advice I've given to folks. So, okay. So like she mentioned, you want to find people to give you feedback. And I don't know if you want me to share my screen to do the animation or
I could do it for you.
Okay, yeah, so you can keep going forward. Okay. So folks who have mentored you, these are great people to ask. If you have a mentor that is going to be someone who knows about your background, has seen you in action, either in the classroom or lab, they'll get to know you and they'll understand your passions, your goals, and experience. So as you look for people who can review your personal statement, mentors who have knowledge of your background can really give you feedback to say, oh, you may have not included this, or this could be a one thing to add. Again, mentoring can happen in different capacity, but if you worked in a lab or some area of work with people, they can really highlight some of your accomplishments and have you share a story or example of grit, perseverance, or creativity. So there are things that you can consider key values that bring out more about how you can contribute to greater science in the future. So just thinking about grad school, what are examples of values that you'll have to demonstrate in grad school? And that's what a lot of people are trying to look for. If you've been a tutor or teaching assistant, again, this is how people can highlight coursework that you've excelled at, and then how you interact with other people. Because in grad school, you're usually doing some form of teaching, whether it's teaching in a formal classroom space or mentoring students on new techniques if they're joining a lab that you're in. So these are different aspects that I think you can think out of the box of people who can bring to light those key items that can set you apart as a candidate. And then think about the diversity of people you ask for feedback. Some people might know you in a longer term capacity, so they can really highlight your goals and passions. If you're a short time working in someone's lab or a class, but you've excelled in that class, these are different folks that can give you some feedback. So I've talked to people who have known me a long time or have known me in different capacity of jobs I've had. So just thinking about how feedback can come from older people, younger people, mentors in different spaces. Okay, and you can go to the next. Because really the biggest takeaway is you want someone else to read your personal statement and make sure that your true self comes out in writing. And I think as being people who evaluate candidates who apply for different positions, we want to see you as a whole person. And I think that perspective is starting to be sort of a grad school focus, is we want to see you as a whole person, not just as a scientist. And next slide. Oh, lastly, so this is going to be a continued feedback and editing process. So I usually tell my students, just write out what you have. Even if it isn't coherent, this is at least you getting your thoughts out. Because then if you sit with someone and you start to flesh out what is going to be important, does this flow as a story? Does it make sense? So this is always a constant editing process. So having a mentor who can help you through this will definitely make your personal statement become much more stronger in the long run. So as we think about culturally relevant and all the people who are on these graduate panels evaluating you as a candidate, most of the graduate school isn't diverse as you think. So there's some, you can go to the next two bullets. So some of the two highlights that you can look at current tenure track faculty, they're more likely to have a parent with a PhD than the general population. So if we think about, if you start to get to more selective institutions, they're going to definitely have more family that come from this demographic. So as we think about who's looking at your overall application, there are going to be people who don't know about some of the more diverse backgrounds that more students are applying. You can go to the next bullet. So thinking about the barriers that people have or different life experiences, your life experience in your cultural background can have you stand out from others. So that's just something you can start to think about, big picture. Okay. And then next slide. Okay. So highlighting this along, this is something I've struggled with, is how do you start to write about yourself without feeling guilty? So I have two examples here. When we think about self-promotion, this is promoting, publicizing. It can come off as bragging sometimes. And there have been studies for gender confidence gaps. So some women are going to describe their ability and performance less favorably than equally performing men. So there have been studies out there that show this confidence gap. And then once you get into the marginalized community, that also exists because of our cultural upbringing. So sometimes we think of, I'm taught to stay humble. I shouldn't be bragging about things I do. But as you're trying to be a competitive candidate, there are things that you want to highlight. And then there's also what we call stereotype threat. So then when people feel at risk for negative stereotypes, they associate with their social group. Some people, especially from marginalized communities, might feel like they aren't representing themselves, but their entire group. So that causes a lot of pressure that makes them more vulnerable to imposter syndrome. I didn't know these things existed when I was starting to look at how do I self-promote myself, because that's not what I've been taught to do. And it's one adjustment I've had to make with talking about myself, writing about myself, and trying not to have that be a bad trait, just so I can let the people who are evaluating me understand my ability and performance. So this is something to keep in the back of your mind, and then talk to other people about, I have done this stuff, but I don't want it to come off as bragging. So what are some ways that I can write it out in a manner that is respectful to me and, my community. So, next slide. Okay, so now that we see these sort of things to be aware of when we're starting to write, what do you want to share? What do you want to think about? And I think Naomi highlighted a few things. And one that I always encounter is motivation to go to grad school. So this is sort of a culturally relevant that talking to different students comes up a lot. Your experience and where you grew up can shape how you are today. If you had a rural community, traditional upbringing, whether you're from a reservation or non-reservation, urban space, or different types of professional jobs that were accessible to you. For me, I didn't know any PhD chemist in my capacity as a elementary, even high school student. So thinking about how that has shifted as you go and take these college courses and you see all these possible professional jobs that are accessible. Motivations on who inspires you. I got really interested in science when my family encountered history of cancer, and I only saw one route of medical school to be in that scope. But who inspired me was family and how this impacts. Other talking points that I've seen people write about that incorporate their culture is how your relationship is with your cultural experience. So I tell people my grandmother, she's Navajo, did cultivation of plants and use those for natural dyes. She was doing sort of organic chemistry in a non-lab setting. But that cultural experience of tying some of more of the traditional knowledge on how I got introduced to science, but not in the more formal capacity of taking organic chemistry. There are personal values, things that have guided me through my Indigenous culture on why maybe I like to work with bacteria instead of human cells or plants or mammalian cells in general. So just thinking about those personal values and how I have gone through being a scientist. How have cultural values impacted your learning? There's a lot of creative ways that you can intersect your traditional knowledge, but also how you can incorporate learning in the form of either storytelling or practice by doing, which I think is all science. So there are things that you can start to bridge into how you are excited about, pursuing graduate school. So these are some things to think about. I did share my personal statement in the Google Drive. So if you want to look about how that incorporates, that's another example. Next slide.
Making noises at me. Okay, there we go.
But I think what it really comes down to is exactly what Naomi had highlighted: be yourself. You want to discuss any aspects of your history, again, beyond academics, that will support you as an excellent candidate. So two things that I think other people don't look at are non-science jobs. Because when you're highlighting skills in the lab, being a TA, managing positions, that's a lot of leadership skills. But I know that when I was in high school, I didn't have a job. I had home duties. We had a farm and animals. So there's a lot of skills that you get in that capacity. And I was always nervous to write about it, but I think it shaped, again, me, how I plan out experiences or experiments is time management. So if you're having to work with your animals or plot out, if I want to plant certain seeds, I have to know all these conditions, and that's all science. But a lot of people think like that isn't a capacity to describe as a non-science job. And I know a lot of families have small stores or business or on the side, like small things that you have to have these other skills, but they're not in a formal job. So, try to think about how those can be incorporated for you. And then just helping with family. I think there's one thing that I learned of being one of the only formally trained scientists in my family is how do we talk about health and diseases, knowing more of the in-depth level. So there, I think, are creative ways that you can bridge these in that can help set you apart from other candidates. So, next slide. Yeah, and then here we have some examples.
All right, and so this example that is shown here is actually comes from the American Indian College Foundation, and we're going to share that document with all of you, but you can see how they highlighted areas to hook, right, the reader, and how to keep things simple and defining yourself. And so you can go ahead and read through this when you want, when we send you the information. But this is just one example. And again, there's actually 7 examples that we're going to provide to you. And at least in the ones that you can tell which ones are mine and which ones are also Dr. Jocelyn Lee, you can see that the theme is relatively the same for the different personal statements, but I do not consider myself the best writer. And so a lot of feedback from individuals and continuously editing it over the years, you can see how it's changed and gotten better. And so again, I'm just going to go to the next slide to show you the resources we're going to have available to you all, but then we'll go look at some examples. And so NIH actually has a slideshow on personal statements that we will provide you. And then the American Indian College Fund, so that Native Pathways, that's where that image came from that was on the previous slide. But let me stop share this. And again, we're just going to show you real quickly, and we're not going to read through every single one. I don't want you to do that, but they're going to be available to you so you can actually kind of see how things have changed, at least for myself and Dr. Jocelyn Lee over the years. Let me see if I can share my screen. I think this is what, yes. Google Chrome. So this is from 2013. I included the prompts down here so you can read through it and see, am I addressing the prompts? And if I am addressing, does this sound like it's something that's popping out or a narrative that is interesting to a reader? Or is it kind of just sound like my resume? Because actually this one really is kind of like my resume. And then I'll just go through here, but this is my more recent one. Again, it's dated 2021. I still have to write personal statements for different things. And again, the themes are relatively the same. I talk about my journey, being one of the few Native chemists, which you actually happen to have 3 on this. And then, this is me where I'm allowed to use the bulleting, the underlining, seeing how those things kind of pop. And then adding sort of not transition sentences, but more like the themes for the different sections. And again, this is only 1 page, but the formatting has pushed it over into 2 pages. And so again, I don't know, Jocelyn, do you want to talk about yours?
Sure. So I applied for a NSF graduate research fellowship in grad school and was awarded this fellowship. So I put in what I submitted. And I think this highlights a little bit of more of a storyline of how I got interested in science and sort of put in examples of undergraduate research through this as why I'm excited to go to graduate school and become a successful graduate student and work on a few projects. So this one's a little bit longer than 1 page, but this is an example on how you can start to integrate, more of a story, but also picking up on some of the various topics that we've talked about. And at the very top are the questions that go with this specific submission. For the personal statement, it said, why are you fascinated by your research area? What examples of leadership skills or unique characteristics bring to your chosen field? Personal and individual strengths that make you a qualified applicant, and then how would this fellowship contribute to your career goals? So think about how you would want to start to answer all of those in a cohesive format. So, and I think the 2-page limit was for that document.
And I just want to reiterate how feedback is so important, because as I showed the first one, if you read through it, it sounds like more of a narrative of my resume. And in fact, I had a mentor who is on this call once tell me, this doesn't sound like you, you need to rewrite it. And I was like, oh, okay, let me modify that. Okay, so I think that's all we have right now. We want to just leave plenty of time now for questions or any other comments that people would like to give.
There was one that popped up in the Q&A. It looks like asking for the Google Link drive again.
Yes, we'll be sharing all the documents with Daryl, and she'll be sending that out to everybody, however they do it. But all the PDFs and everything for those presentations from NIH, from American Indian College Foundation, all of our examples in these slides will be available to everybody.
There's another question that popped up. The question is, how can I tie in specific faculty I want to work with?
I guess I can start with that. So right now I'm helping, December 1st is sort of the big day for graduate school. So I've been helping a student. So it depends. Each graduate school may ask a specific number you want to give an example with. So I always recommend students to look at the school they're interested, find at least 3 or 4 faculty that they're interested in their research, and then figure out, is there something unique about that faculty member? I've written about how I'm interested in computational chemistry when I was looking at graduate programs. So this person had the capacity to use different techniques in order to study protein active sites. So I talked about my work studying more of the biological or I guess wet lab portion of purifying proteins, but I'm more interested in, the scope of the research. And then looking at other labs on how I want more experience with protein purification. So using that guide of identifying faculty members, their topic, and then trying to look at, how does my interest work? And again, it's not that you have to join those labs, but it's giving the graduate school panel thinking about, if I want to evaluate this student, they're interested in these labs. They're not just going to say, I like this school because of the location. So just keep that in mind of really looking at faculty websites and more of their scope for research.
And I also think to point out, so looking at what the university wants, if they want a research interest in a personal statement, maybe who you want to work with would be better fit into the research interest document. It just depends on what they're requiring, because there you could talk about your research experience, what you want to do with your life when you grow up. And then you can say, and therefore these people would be great for me to work with because I kind of already have the skill set or I have an interest in these areas. So again, it really comes down to, do they only want one document where you can include that, or maybe who you want to work with might be more suited for research interest statement type of document.
All right, great. Those are really good responses. We got a couple more questions that have come in. The first one, what do you do when you have no faculty that you're close to send letters of recommendation?
That's a tricky one, because I even ask students that are in my class now, like, who's going to write your letters? And in my research lab, specifically, if they're in my research lab, they should want to get one at least for me, right? And then I ask them, who else is going to write letters? Are these appropriate individuals? So if you're not doing research, in a lab right now and you're looking to apply to this cycle, you really should start reaching out and just meeting with some of the faculty that you did good in their class and trying to get their feedback if they're willing to write a letter for you.
Yeah, to also think about that, faculty, if you're in a lab, like an upper level division lab, thinking about if there were some labs that highlighted your critical thinking skills, creativity, reaching out to those faculty who can help support that. If you're looking for non-faculty members, if you've had a job, that might be something you'd have to figure out. What are transferable skills that can go to graduate school? So that might be another alternative, but most graduate schools are looking for experience in the lab. So I would prioritize those people. Secondly, then go to faculty you've had lab courses with as an alternative.
Great. All right, we got a couple more questions here. This one comes from a faculty member, and they are listening in to learn about how to help their students. What is a good way for students to explain that one bad semester or time period, poor grades, or they had to stop out and return?
I can speak to that because that was me. I think that was a lot of us. And I also, it's as individual or faculty members that is looking at graduate school applications, we want to see the progress. How are you progressing? Did you have a bad first year, but you've gotten continually better? If you were doing great and then all of a sudden there was a bad year, talk about what happened. Like maybe you had some personal issue that occurred, don't try to ignore, but maybe what you learned from that type of experience. I mean, because that was exactly me when I was applying to graduate school.
Yeah, I've talked to, maybe not in this specific example I put in the Google Drive, but I do look back at how I had to take calculus again. That was one of my grades that was more affected. That, as faculty, we do look at, hopefully, I would say, the whole school or your whole transcript. So if you want to highlight that single class, that's fine. But if it's a whole semester, I think it's valuable to share what happened, but that's really on to the student. If it's a very personal matter, you can go in on the higher level, but if there's something that is you want to share, then you can go a little bit deeper. And that can also highlight some of those characteristics of overcoming this barrier or persevering through a difficult situation. So these are things that it's really up to the individual on how they want to explain it. I don't think I would go more than like a full paragraph on it, but it is probably, if it's a whole bad semester, I would probably write about it in my personal statement and try to have a more positive spin as an outcome instead of just saying I did poorly. But most students that I've talked to, they've improved their grades or they're on the trajectory to do that. So it's not like it's a complete thing that comes up with, I was trying to look at the question, or stop out and returning. So that's the other thing, is if you had to come back to the course or to the school.
All right. All right, and then the next question we have, when applying for smaller fellowships with short, one-page long statements, what are your thoughts on how making sure you spend enough time talking about yourself when you also need to talk about your research? And why would we benefit from the fellowship?
Yeah, I mean, I sit on the Ford Foundation fellowship, which is the application is very similar to the NSF GRFP. So a lot of students that apply to the NSF also apply to Ford Foundation. And those are actually kind of different documents, as I've been saying, where they're supposed to talk about what they've done, how they've contributed to diversity or inclusion. And then the research is a separate document. For a 1 page, I myself have not seen where you have to talk about your personal statement and research in a single page. So I guess maybe that would require getting some specific feedback from individuals if it is requiring those topics.
On these shorter ones, I would recommend like choosing a theme. So this is where your writing skills really come out on how do you want to tell the story. So for this fellowship, looking at why you would benefit from the fellowship. Not all your research experience is going to fit that. So try to choose one single experience if your personal statement is asking about that, and then try to think about how previous experience feeds into that. So breaking this down into a story that is cohesive and then fitting that page restriction, and then getting feedback from people to say, yeah, does this make sense or does it work for this?
This is really great and valuable information that you're both sharing. So the next question that comes in, can we use contractions in our statements?
I don't typically use it. I don't see most people use, and contractions, if you're not sure, are like I am is I'm, right? Or do not is don't. And so I typically do not use them. I don't know if there's a written rule out there about it, but I don't.
Yeah, I don't think I use them either.
Okay. All right. Next question. When attempting to explain poor academic performance, how much detail should be shared when it has been discovered that it was related to an undiagnosed learning disability?
Yeah, I would say that's a tricky one. But I think as people are starting to evaluate all the variety of ways we learn, I think it's really up to the individual on what they feel is comfortable that they want to share. They could say that, if this was something not documented, but it is now documented, that could be something that you could tie in. But for this, I think it's hard for a panel if it's not documented. You could also spin it as you improved your study strategies, if it's not going to be this undiagnosed or undocumented. I think having you reflect is good for the graduate panel to start to look at, all right, this individual obviously had a semester of poor academic performance, but they reevaluated their study strategies, and you could highlight, this is what I did to improve. I think that's a probably more feasible way than blaming it on like, and I don't want to say blaming it, but relating it back to that undiagnosed learning disability. So that might be something to connect that, and just because I know more folks are wanting documentation these days, but I think reflecting on how you improved could be a way to highlight that poor academic performance.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Dr. Jocelyn Lee just said.
Okay. All right. This is another question. If my university does not offer research experience in areas I'm interested in, are there any options to gain research experience via online methods or external methods so that we may work towards letters of recommendation? If so, are there resources that can help me find these options? Thank you.
I think that might be a little bit easier now with the COVID and where everybody had to shift to online learning for many different areas. Even in the wet labs, we had a lot of students that had to do sort of more virtual online type of experiments. If you're referring to as now you're an undergrad and there isn't a research area that you're interested in, I would highly encourage you, depending on what year you are, to just get that experience as a young person, because you're an undergrad, you're going to move on. As a graduate, if you're already in graduate school, that might be a little bit more tricky to navigate that. And as far as online methods or external methods, it really kind of depends on your area. So again, you can reach out to one of us individually, and maybe we can give you more specific feedback, but without knowing exactly your area of interest and what you're doing, it's hard for me to comment.
So I fell in this category. I did my PhD in computational chemistry. I didn't have a formal class. What happened was I was working at a pharmaceutical company and met with computational chemists in that capacity. So for me, I did my own sort of, how do I think about a computer? How do I start learning some of the basics? At the time, there wasn't all these resources. So looking at publishable or readily available teaching modules, those were even limited. So I ended up just highlighting that I did research in the wet lab, or I had experience that got me interested in this area and I want to learn more. So there are some fields that aren't accessible to folks that are at primary undergrads or community colleges, thinking about how you're able to get that experience. But that might be something to help share. If you're interested in computing, there's a lot of, like Naomi alluded to, online tutorials. So I think there are some great how to learn some command line skills, how to start looking at sequencing data, molecular modeling tools out there these days. So that might just take some time sitting down and getting familiar with a little bit of the protocols, and then you can start looking at literature and try to digest some of the tools or techniques that people use in that space. So those would be some of my recommendations.
I can see in the chat there's a question about deciding on graduate school location. So I want to go to a public grad school on the West Coast, where I find it is more culturally friendlier for me, whereas staying in this New England WASPy bubble, I have been able to find more resources and opportunities for grad school, but at the same time, it is very tough here culturally. What would you recommend as far as what my priorities for grad school should be? Jocelyn, do you want to take this one first?
Okay, yeah, so I did my PhD in New England, and being one of the few Indigenous students on my campus, yeah, it's very isolating. So I went back down to the idea of, do I want to stay on the East Coast or try to go West Coast? I prioritized the types of skills for graduate school because I also had my sister in the area. So for me, that cultural portion, I did put it at a lower level than, and prioritized, I want to learn computing and chemistry. And that was my decision for grad school. For my postdoc, I decided to go to a school that was more around Indigenous communities. So I chose my postdoc as that, but also found a lab that did work that I was also interested in. So it's really a personal decision. You know, if you want to have the training that's going to be pivotal for your next step, I would recommend choosing a department or looking at mentors that excel in that area. Just because you'll have the best training. Yes, it is 5 to 7 years of your life you're committing to. But when I was in New England, I found my community. I was into running. So that was one way I built my culture community space of people. I also volunteered outside of grad school. So it gave me a break away and I found like-minded people. The whole Indigenous aspect, I had to figure out how to balance that by only going home once a year. And then traditional foods, my sister and I would cook together, but yeah, it was a tough time to find that connection. But I think the other types of communities helped me get through grad school. And once I was done, I was able to move to other places for jobs.
And I would say, I mean, I'm from the East Coast and I went to school on the East Coast, and I was always one of maybe a couple of students, whether as an undergrad or graduate student, that were Native. And so that was a struggle for me. If I look back, I might have probably chose a different university where I had some of that cultural support, because at the time I knew I needed it. And so again, this is your priorities. So we can't decide what your priorities are. And so you have to decide, kind of like what Jocelyn alluded to. Is it the training? Is it the culture? And just to give you an example, I had a recent student graduate and she applied to many different institutions, but it was accepted into some of the top tier institutions, but she decided to go to the institution that was going to provide her the most support culturally, while also giving her the training that she wanted. And so again, this is really about you reflecting on what's important to you and what you think you're going to need to survive in graduate school.
The last thing, when you start looking at schools, identifying what are the support systems. So that is one thing that you can find out before you start applying. And then if you do get invited to interview with the school, you can really see that community and aspects of how students are supported either culturally, or is there a group of grad students who sort of form their own. So just some things to think about as you start to look at schools.
All right, there's one last question, and it's asking, do you have connections regarding law school as well? Law school is always such a mystery. So just
Well, I've had some friends who finished PhDs and gone to law schools. I have some that are went into programs that were JD PhD type of programs, and so they do exist out there. If this is something you would really like to learn more about, I can connect you with these individuals and they can give you their experience. I know some of them also did at the University of New Mexico, they have a indigenous law like training program, and I'm not sure if UNM is the only institution, but that will help them get integrated into the law school environment before they jumped headfirst into it.
Yeah, I don't have as much on what types of personal statements are required, so that'll just be looking at law schools themselves. But I think as it's been brought up, just thinking about people who've been through that recently can give you more insight. But yeah, in the sciences, usually see people do a PhD first and then apply for a JD. So that's something you can also look at, what types of programs are out there, and really go into the application process to see what they require. And I know a lot of them are more standardized tests, so that's something you can set yourself aside from and bring more of you out versus just being a test number from those types of schools.
all right. Well, we are close to the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I think we will wrap up here. I just wanted to thank our wonderful presenters today, Doctors Naomi Lee and Jocelyn Lee. And I know we put in the chat, if you enjoyed this webinar, feel free to share a reaction, drop a comment, a thank you. And just FYI, following this webinar, you will be sent a survey. It'll take less than 3 minutes of your time to complete. And as members and community, supportive community, your feedback is very critical to us. Please take a few moments to submit the survey and let us know what you thought about today's webinar. Your feedback, again, will help us improve as we identify future topics. And then the other thing to note is, if you enjoyed today's webinar, you can find more upcoming and previous webinar recordings on our website at sacnas.org/webinars. All right, this concludes our webinar today with Naomi and Jocelyn. Thank you again for taking time to join us, and we will see you next time. Oh, one more thing before we go. Sorry, before I really end this. For those, we will be sharing a recording of this along with all of the materials that were mentioned before. So be on the lookout for that email. It should be coming within the next week. All right. All right, everyone, thank you again for attending.